Every single person listed in Genesis chapter 5 follows the exact same pattern. Born, lived, died, born, lived, died, over and over again, like a drumbeat that never changes. Seth lived 912 years, and he died. Enosh lived 905 years, and he died. Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, born, lived, died. The rhythm is relentless. It is almost hypnotic in its repetition. And then, the pattern breaks. Enoch lived 65 years, and he walked with God. And then Enoch was no more, no death, no burial, no grave. Just gone. Of all the billions of human beings who have ever walked this earth, only 2 men in the entire biblical record are described with this specific phrase, walking with God. Not Abraham, who was called the friend of God. Not Moses, who spoke with God face to face. Not David, the man after God's own heart. Only 2, Enoch and Noah. And when you understand what that Hebrew phrase actually means, when you crack open the original language and look at what is buried beneath the surface of that text, everything you thought you knew about what it means to have a relationship with God begins to shift. Because here is what most people miss: the word translated as walked is not the ordinary Hebrew word for walking. It is not the word you would use to describe someone strolling down a road or moving from one place to another. The ancient writers chose a completely different word, a word with layers, a word with dimensions that the English translation simply cannot carry. And hidden inside that word is a portrait of intimacy so radical, so progressive, so mutual, that it raises a question that should stop every one of us cold. What does it actually cost to walk with God the way Enoch walked with him? Let that question sit for a moment, because the answer is not what most people expect. And by the time we reach the end of this study, you are going to encounter something in the text of Genesis that almost no one talks about. A detail so precise, so intentional, that it connects Enoch's disappearance directly to something Jesus said about the last days. Something that changes the way you read not just Genesis, but the entire arc of Scripture. Now, before we go any further, consider the world Enoch was born into. He was the 7th generation from Adam. 7, the number of completion, of divine perfection in Hebrew thought. The ancient rabbis noticed this. The early church fathers noticed this. It was not accidental. Enoch occupied a position in the genealogical structure of Genesis that carried symbolic weight, and the text seems to be signaling something before it even tells us what happened to him. His father was Jared. His son was Methuselah, the man who would live longer than any other human being in recorded history, 969 years. And somewhere between those 2 generations, something happened to Enoch that had never happened before, and would only happen one more time in all of biblical history. He walked with God, and God walked with him. The pieces begin to align when you realize that this phrase appears not once but twice in the 5 verses devoted to Enoch in Genesis chapter 5. Twice. In a genealogy that gives every other figure 1 sentence, Enoch gets repetition. The ancient Hebrew writers did not waste words. Repetition in the text is never decorative. It is structural. It is intentional. It is the text itself leaning forward and saying, "Pay attention to this. This is not like the others." So the question becomes, what was actually happening during those 300 years described as walking with God? What did that relationship look like from the inside? What did Enoch experience, see, and surrender that no one else in his generation did? The original language holds the first key, and what it reveals is startling. The Hebrew word is not simply halach, to walk, it is hithalech. And the difference between those 2 words is the difference between a casual acquaintance and a lifelong covenant. Stay with this, because the architecture of that single word is about to reframe everything. If this study is already opening something up in you, do not keep it to yourself. Hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to put this in front of someone who needs it. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now, because what comes next goes even deeper into the Hebrew. And what we find there is going to shake the foundation of how you understand intimacy with God. Hithalek. Say it slowly. Hithalek. That single word buried in the 5th chapter of Genesis carries more weight than most entire theological libraries. And what most translations miss is that when the ancient Hebrew scribes chose this specific form of the verb, they were not simply describing movement, they were describing a state of being. Here is what the original language reveals. The Hebrew verb halach means to walk. Simple, straightforward, ordinary. It is used hundreds of times throughout the Old Testament to describe people moving from one place to another. But Enoch's walk and Noah's walk is never described with halach alone. The text uses the hitpail stem, hithalek, and the hitpail stem in biblical Hebrew is the reflexive form. It turns the action back on the subject. It makes the verb ongoing, continuous, habitual. It does not describe something that happened once. It describes something that became the defining rhythm of an entire life. The pieces begin to align when we understand what this grammatical choice actually communicates. Enoch was not someone who walked with God occasionally. He was not someone who had powerful encounters on mountaintops and then returned to ordinary life. The hitpail stem tells us that this walking was self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating, progressively deepening over time. Each step drew him further in. Each encounter recalibrated him for the next. The walk itself was changing the one who walked. Now consider the implications of that for a moment. The same verbal form, hithalek, appears in Genesis 17 verse 1, when God appears to Abram and says, "Walk before me and be blameless." Same stem, same structure. But notice the directional difference. With Abram, God is issuing a command, "Walk before me, in my presence, under my gaze." With Enoch, no command appears in the text, no instruction, no call. The text simply states, as though reporting the most natural thing in the world, that Enoch walked with God. The preposition is et, meaning with, alongside, in the company of, not before, not after, with. What most translations miss is the mutuality embedded in that single preposition. This is not a servant walking ahead of a master to clear the road. This is not a disciple trailing behind a rabbi at a respectful distance. This is two beings moving in the same direction, at the same pace, in deliberate companionship. The Hebrew construction implies proximity that was chosen, maintained, and sustained by both parties. And this is precisely where the ancient prophet Amos enters the conversation with a question that cuts like a blade. Amos chapter 3, verse 3. "Do two walk together unless they have agreed to do so?" Hidden beneath the surface of this text is a theological principle that reframes everything we think we know about spiritual intimacy. The Hebrew word translated as agreed is ya'ad, and ya'ad does not simply mean to have a casual conversation and reach a mutual understanding. Ya'ad carries the weight of an appointed meeting, a summons to a fixed time and a fixed place, an agreement forged in advance with intention, with commitment, with full awareness of what is being entered into. Amos is not asking a rhetorical question for the sake of poetry. He is laying out a law, a cosmic architecture. Two beings cannot sustain synchronized movement unless there is prior agreement about direction, about destination, about pace. And when we carry that principle back to Genesis 5 and apply it to Enoch, the question it raises is staggering. What did Enoch agree to that the rest of his generation refused? Because here is what the text does not say, and the silence here is as significant as the words themselves. It does not tell us that Enoch was sinless. It does not say he was a priest or a prophet in the formal sense. It does not record a dramatic conversion experience or a burning bush encounter. It simply tells us that he walked with God for 300 years. 300 years of hithalek. 300 years of that self-reinforcing, progressively deepening, mutually chosen movement. Early church fathers interpreted this sustained walk as evidence of something they called theosis, the progressive transformation of the human person through sustained communion with the divine. Irenaeus saw in Enoch a prototype of what humanity was always meant to become. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, renders the phrase as Enoch was well-pleasing to God, capturing not just the action of walking, but the quality of relationship that the walking produced. A relationship so aligned, so harmonized, so deeply synchronized, that it registered in the heavenly realms as pleasure. Let that truth sink in. 300 years of a life so oriented toward God that heaven itself called it pleasing. But here is what the text of Genesis 5 still has not told us, and what we desperately need to understand. What was actually happening during those 300 years? What did the walk look like from the inside? What did Enoch see, hear, and encounter as he moved deeper into that divine companionship? For that answer, we have to go somewhere that most Sunday sermons never take you, to a text so ancient, so detailed, and so strikingly precise about the nature of Enoch's experience that the earliest followers of Jesus treated it as sacred scripture, a text that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a text quoted directly in the New Testament book of Jude, a text that describes what happens when a human being walks with God long enough to begin crossing the threshold between the seen and the unseen world. And what it describes will reframe everything that comes next. There is a book that almost made it into your Bible. Not almost in the casual sense, almost in the sense that the earliest followers of Jesus read it, copied it, studied it, and in some communities treated it as scripture. Almost in the sense that the Apostle Jude quoted it directly in his letter, a letter that did make it into the New Testament canon. Almost in the sense that fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved by a community of Jewish scholars who considered it among the most sacred texts in their possession. The book is called First Enoch, and what it describes about the nature of Enoch's walk with God is so detailed, so structurally precise, so theologically loaded, that once you encounter it, you cannot read Genesis 5 the same way again. But before we open that text, we need to understand the world it emerged from. Because the ancient world that produced First Enoch was not a world that invented spiritual experiences for entertainment. These were communities of scholars, priests, and mystics who lived inside the Hebrew scriptures the way most people today live inside their social media feeds, constantly, devotedly, with every detail carrying interpretive weight. When they wrote about Enoch, they were not writing fiction. They were doing what ancient Jewish scholars called midrash, filling in the sacred gaps that the biblical text deliberately left open. And Genesis 5 leaves an enormous gap, 300 years of walking with God. That is all we are given. 300 years and not a single scene, not a single conversation, not a single recorded encounter between Enoch and the divine. The text gives us the destination. He was no more because God took him without giving us the journey. And the ancient world could not let that silence stand unanswered. Now here is what makes First Enoch so extraordinary. The text does not read like mythology. It does not read like allegory dressed in spiritual language. It reads like a first-hand account of a man who was granted access to realms of reality that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary human perception. And the consistency of its theological architecture, across chapters, across centuries of composition, across multiple literary traditions, suggests something that scholars have wrestled with for generations. This text knows something. The opening chapters of First Enoch describe Enoch being approached by angelic beings who lift him beyond the physical world and begin showing him the hidden structure of creation. He is taken to the foundations of the earth. He is shown the chambers where the winds are stored, the pillars that hold the cosmos in place, the storehouse of the stars. He sees the mountain of God burning with an unapproachable fire, and at its summit, the throne of the Ancient of Days, a description so strikingly parallel to Daniel chapter 7 that scholars have debated for centuries which text influenced the other. But what is most significant for our study is not the cosmic geography. It is the relational dynamic that First Enoch describes between Enoch and God throughout these journeys, because hidden beneath the surface of this text is a portrait of the Hithelek, that progressive, self-deepening, mutually chosen walk that matches the grammatical architecture of Genesis 5 with breathtaking precision. In First Enoch, the walk is never passive. Every encounter produces transformation. Every revelation demands a response. Every time Enoch is shown something in the heavenly realms, the text records his reaction, and his reaction is always one of deeper surrender, deeper alignment, deeper agreement with the divine perspective on reality. The Ya'ad that Amos described, that appointed covenantal agreement between two beings moving in the same direction, is not a single moment in First Enoch. It is a continuous process. a living negotiation between a human will and a divine one, repeated over 300 years, until the gap between them became so thin that it finally dissolved altogether. Early church fathers saw this clearly. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, identified Enoch as a prototype of what the ancient Greeks called theosis, the progressive divinization of the human person through sustained union with God. Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the most significant theologians of the 2nd century, placed Enoch alongside Elijah as evidence that God's original intention for humanity was not death, but translation. A word that carries in its Latin root the meaning of being carried across, moved from one state to another without the interruption of physical dissolution. Pause and consider the weight of that theological claim for a moment. Irenaeus was not speaking casually. He was making an argument rooted in the structure of redemptive history, that Enoch's translation was not an anomaly, but a preview, a prophetic prototype embedded in the earliest chapters of Genesis, pointing forward to a reality that the New Testament would later articulate in full. And this is precisely where the book of First Enoch connects to something that most readers completely overlook when they return to the biblical text itself. Because the ancient scholars who studied Enoch's walk noticed a pattern that the surface reading of Genesis 5 conceals. They noticed that the 300 years described as Hithelek, as that progressive, deepening, synchronized movement with God, did not begin until after a specific event in Enoch's life. Not his birth, not some dramatic spiritual encounter recorded in a text we no longer have. Something far more ordinary, far more human. Enoch was 65 years old when his son Methuselah was born, and the text tells us, it is right there in Genesis 5 verse 22, that it was after the birth of Methuselah that Enoch walked with God. The ancient rabbis noticed this. The Midrash Rabbah reflects on it. Scholars across centuries have circled back to this detail because the text seems to be signaling something deeply intentional. The walk began with fatherhood. The walk began with the weight of generational responsibility pressing down on a man who suddenly understood that what he carried, his son would inherit. Some scholars argue this is coincidental, simply the narrative structure of the genealogy. Others propose that it reflects an ancient Near Eastern coming-of-age tradition, where full spiritual maturity was marked by the birth of one's firstborn. But when we examine the evidence across the full scope of the Hebrew Scriptures and the intertestamental literature, a third interpretation begins to emerge, one that is more theologically rich than either of the first two. The walk with God began when Enoch came face to face with his own mortality, refracted through new life. Holding Methuselah, the child who would outlive every human being in history, Enoch looked into the face of the next generation and felt something shift in his understanding of time, of purpose, of what it means to exist in a world where the pattern is born, lived, died. And in that moment of reckoning, something in Enoch chose differently. He did not simply believe in God, he agreed with God. He entered the Ya'ad. He began the Hithelech. And 300 years later, he had walked so far in that direction that there was no longer any road left between where he was and where God was. But here is what the text of Genesis still has not shown us, and what the book of First Enoch only partially answers. Because when we cross-reference Enoch's walk with the account of the second man who walked with God, a man named Noah, we find something in Genesis 6:9 that introduces a dimension of this walk that Enoch never had to face. A single qualifier, a single word of contrast embedded in the text like a splinter, and that word changes the entire meaning of what it costs to walk with God. Now here is what the text of Genesis 6:9 does that almost every reader misses on the first pass. It does not simply say that Noah walked with God. It says Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. Three descriptors stacked together in a single verse: righteous, blameless, walking with God. And hidden beneath the surface of that construction is a qualifier that appears nowhere in Enoch's account. Four words that carry the weight of an entire civilization's collapse among the people of his time. The ancient rabbis noticed this immediately. The Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin records a debate that has echoed through Jewish scholarship for centuries. a debate about whether that qualifier is a complement or a limitation. Some scholars argue that blameless among the people of his time simply means Noah was exceptional by the standards of his corrupt generation. Others propose that it is a subtle diminishment, that Noah was righteous relative to his age, but that placed in a different era, standing alongside Abraham or Moses, the comparison might have revealed fractures in his character that the darkness around him conveniently concealed. But when we examine the evidence through the lens of the Hebrew text itself, a third interpretation begins to emerge, one that is more theologically precise than either of the first two. And it centers not on Noah's moral standing, but on the context in which his walk with God took place. Consider the world Genesis 6 describes before it ever mentions Noah's name. The text says, in verse 5, that God saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Pause and consider the architecture of that sentence. Not occasionally evil, not predominantly evil, only evil. All the time. The Hebrew word translated as only is rak, an intensifier of exclusion. It means nothing but, nothing else, without remainder. This is not a world in moral decline. This is a world that has reached the terminus of moral collapse. A world where the hithalek, that progressive, self-reinforcing walk of alignment with the divine, had been universally abandoned. Every human being in Noah's generation had chosen the opposite direction. Every inclination, every thought, every time. And into that world, Genesis 6:9 places a single man walking with God. The pieces begin to align when we understand what that contrast actually cost, because Enoch's walk, extraordinary as it was, unfolded in a world that had not yet fully dissolved. The genealogy of Genesis 5, for all its repetitive drumbeat of death, still reflects a world with structure, with generational continuity, with enough residual order that a man could choose alignment with God without that choice placing him in direct opposition to every human being around him. Noah had no such luxury. The Hebrew word tamim, translated as blameless, appears 45 times in the Old Testament, and the pattern of its usage is deeply revealing. It appears in Leviticus and Numbers to describe sacrificial animals, animals that are without defect, whole, complete, undivided. It appears in Psalm 18, verse 32, to describe the way of God himself. His way is tamim, perfect, without fracture. And it appears in Deuteronomy 18, verse 13, as a command to the people of Israel, "Be tamim before the Lord your God," whole, undivided, without the internal contradictions that fracture a life between two directions. When Genesis 6:9 applies tamim to Noah in a world where every inclination of every human heart was only evil all the time, the text is making a structural claim that goes far beyond moral biography. It is saying that Noah maintained internal wholeness, undivided allegiance, unbroken alignment, in an environment specifically engineered to produce fragmentation. A world that pressed on every side with the accumulated weight of universal corruption and could not crack him. What most translations miss is the spiritual dimension of what that kind of resistance actually requires. Because tamim is not gritted teeth moralism. It is not white-knuckled religious performance. The literary structure of Genesis 6 reveals something far more profound when we examine how the text positions Noah's walk with God in direct temporal relationship to the corruption surrounding him. The Hebrew construction places his blamelessness and his walking with God in the same breath as cause and effect, or perhaps more precisely, as two descriptions of the same reality viewed from different angles. The walk produced the wholeness sustained the walk. Now here is where the typology becomes staggering, because hidden beneath the surface of Genesis 6 is a pattern that the New Testament will later identify as explicitly prophetic. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 37 through 39, Jesus himself reaches back across the centuries to the days of Noah as a direct parallel for the conditions that will precede his return. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. Notice what Jesus does not say. He does not say the days of Noah were uniquely violent or unusually wicked, though they were both. He identifies the distinguishing characteristic of Noah's generation as unawareness. They knew nothing, not because the information was unavailable. Noah had been building an ark in plain sight for decades, but because the depth of their moral and spiritual corruption had rendered them incapable of perceiving what was directly in front of them. The spiritual dimension of this is profound. When every inclination of the human heart is oriented away from God, the capacity for prophetic perception atrophies. The eyes still function, the ears still process sound, but the interior faculty that allows a human being to read the signs of the heavenly realms, to perceive the movement of the divine within the structure of ordinary events, goes dark. Noah kept that faculty alive. 300 years earlier, so had Enoch. And what both men shared, what the Typology in its deepest grammatical sense points toward, was not primarily a moral achievement. It was a perceptual one. They could see what their generation could not see, because they had maintained alignment with the one who sees everything. But now consider the question the text has been building toward since the very first verse of Genesis 5. If Enoch's walk ended in translation, in being taken by God across the threshold between the physical and the eternal, and Noah's walk ended in preservation through the destruction of the world he had navigated, what does the walk with God ultimately produce in the human being who sustains it? The answer is embedded in the most cryptic sentence in all of Genesis, and it connects directly to something so unexpected, so structurally precise, that when Jesus referenced the days of Noah in Matthew 24, he may have been pointing to far more than just a historical parallel. He may have been pointing to a pattern that is about to repeat. Now we arrive at the sentence that has haunted biblical scholars, theologians, and ancient mystics for thousands of years. Genesis 5 verse 24. 5 words in the original Hebrew. 5 words that carry more theological weight than entire volumes of systematic theology. Vayithalech Chanoch et ha-Elohim ve'ainenu kilakach oto Elohim. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Hidden beneath the surface of that final phrase is a word that almost every English translation flattens into something far too ordinary. The word is lakach, and the original language reveals something startling about what actually happened in that moment when Enoch disappeared from human history. Lakach appears over 900 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and when we examine the full range of its usage across those 900 occurrences, a pattern emerges that is unmistakable. Lakach is never a passive word. It is never accidental. It carries within it the force of deliberate divine action, of God reaching into the physical realm and extracting something for a specific purpose. It is the word used in Genesis 2 verse 15, when God takes the man and places him in the garden. It is the word used in Genesis 22 verse 2, when God tells Abraham to take his son, the son he loves, and offer him on the mountain. It is the word used across the prophetic literature when God seizes a prophet and repositions him in the spiritual landscape of revelation. When lakach is applied to Enoch in Genesis 5:24, it is not describing a gentle spiritual departure. It is describing a sovereign act of divine appropriation. God reached into the continuum of ordinary human existence and took Enoch out of it. Not because Enoch had finished something, but because the walk had reached a threshold that ordinary human existence could no longer contain. Now consider what Hebrews chapter 11 verse 5 adds to this picture. The New Testament writer, looking back across more than 2,000 years of theological reflection on this event, offers a clarification so precise that it feels almost forensic in its specificity. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him. And the text adds, "For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God." The Greek word translated as taken here is metatithemi, and hidden beneath the surface of that Greek construction is the same theological architecture we found in the Hebrew lakach, the idea of transposition, of being moved from one category of existence to another. The Latin translators rendered it as translatus est. He was translated, carried across, repositioned, not destroyed, not dissolved, carried from one dimension of reality into another by the direct action of a God who had been walking alongside him for 3 centuries. Early church fathers saw in this the fulfillment of something that Genesis was always gesturing toward. Irenaeus argued that Enoch and Elijah, the only 2 figures in the biblical canon who bypass physical death entirely, are not anomalies but previews, prophetic prototypes of what humanity was designed to become before the intrusion of death into the created order. The pattern is unmistakable when we examine the typology across both testaments. Enoch is translated before the judgment of the flood. Elijah is translated before the judgment that falls on Israel. Both exits occur at the edge of catastrophic divine reckoning. Both are preceded by a sustained, intimate walk with God that separated these men fundamentally from the generation surrounding them. This isn't merely historical, it's prophetic. And the typology here points to something that Jesus himself would later make explicit in a way that most readers of Matthew 24 have never fully processed. But before we arrive there, we need to sit with what the spiritual dimension of Enoch's translation actually reveals about the nature of the Hithelek itself. Because what First Enoch describes in its closing chapters, the culmination of Enoch's progressive walk with God, is not simply a reward for good behavior. It is the logical terminus of a trajectory that was established in the very grammar of Genesis 5. The Hitpel stem, as we examined earlier, describes an action that is reflexive and self-perpetuating, a walk that deepens itself through the act of walking. And what First Enoch reveals about the final stages of that walk is theologically staggering. The text describes Enoch being transformed in the presence of God, his physical form reconstituted, his earthly limitations progressively dissolved, until the boundary between the human and the divine becomes so attenuated that translation is not so much a miraculous intervention as it is a natural conclusion. The walk did not end when Enoch was taken. The walk arrived at its destination. Ancient scholars noticed a pattern embedded in this that connects directly to Paul's language in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, where he describes believers being transformed into the image of God with ever-increasing glory, as by the Spirit of the Lord. The Greek word translated as transformed there is metamorpho, the same root from which we derive metamorphosis, a biological process in which an organism does not simply change its behavior, but changes its fundamental nature through the internal logic of its own development. Paul is not describing a purely future event. He is describing a present progressive reality, a Hithelek of the soul, in which sustained alignment with the divine progressively reconfigures the one who walks. The pieces begin to align when we understand that what happened to Enoch in Genesis 5 was not the suspension of natural law. It was natural law operating at a level that physical death was never designed to interrupt. Now here is where the eschatological dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Because when Jesus reaches back to the days of Noah in Matthew 24 and says that the coming of the Son of Man will mirror that ancient moment of judgment and translation, he is not simply drawing a meteorological parallel. He is pointing to a pattern of divine operation that recurs at specific thresholds in redemptive history. Before the flood, translation. Before the judgment on Israel, translation. And before the final consummation of all things, what does Paul tell the church in 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 17? That those who are alive and remain will be caught up. The Greek word is harpazo, seized, taken by force, lakach. The same divine action that reached into Genesis 5 and extracted Enoch from the stream of ordinary human existence. What most translations miss is that harpazo is not a gentle word. It is the word used when Philip is suddenly transported in Acts 8. It is the word Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 12 to describe being caught up to the third heaven. It carries within it the full force of lakach, of sovereign divine appropriation, of God reaching across the boundary between the seen and unseen world, and repositioning a human being according to a purpose that transcends the categories of ordinary existence. The spiritual dimension of all of this converges on a question that the text has been building toward since the very first page of Genesis. If the walk with God, The hithalek, the self-reinforcing, progressively deepening, mutually chosen movement of alignment between a human will and a divine one, if that walk is capable of producing translation, transformation, and ultimately the dissolution of the boundary between the earthly and the heavenly, then what does it require of us? Not in the abstract, not in the theological, but in the actual fabric of a daily life, lived in the 21st century, in a world that Jesus himself compared to the days of Noah. Because hidden beneath the surface of everything we have examined, the Hebrew grammar, the prophetic typology, the ancient scholarship, the New Testament fulfillment, is a single, unavoidable, deeply personal question. Are you walking? And if you are, in which direction? And now we arrive at the question that every grammatical layer of the Hebrew, every ancient manuscript, every prophetic typology, every theological thread we have followed through the architecture of Genesis has been building toward. What happens to a human being who walks all the way to God? Not partially, not occasionally, not in the Sunday morning sense of the word, where we show up, sing the songs, and return to lives that are largely oriented in a different direction, but in the hithalek sense, the self-reinforcing, progressively deepening, 300-year sense. What happens when a human will enters into such sustained, unbroken alignment with the divine that the ya'ad, that covenantal agreement of direction and destination, becomes the defining architecture of an entire existence? Genesis 5 verse 24 gives us the answer in 5 Hebrew words, and hidden beneath the surface of those 5 words is a revelation so structurally precise, so typologically loaded, so prophetically charged, that the entire sweep of redemptive history from Genesis to Revelation can be read as an extended commentary on what they contain. Vayithalech chanoch et ha-Elohim ve'einenu ki lakach oto Elohim. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Ve'einenu, he was not. 3 letters in the original Hebrew. A negation so complete, so absolute, that the ancient rabbis struggled for centuries to interpret it without reducing it to something manageable. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, renders this phrase as kai ouch hurisketo, and he was not found, not simply absent, not merely deceased, searched for and not located. The community looked, the family looked, history looked, and there was nothing to find, because something had happened that left no remains. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 5 confirms what the Hebrew text implies but does not fully articulate. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him. And then, positioned with unmistakable intentionality immediately after this declaration, the text delivers a statement that functions as both explanation and invitation. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. The original language reveals something startling in the structure of that passage. The Greek word translated as earnestly seek is exetio, a compound verb that carries within it the same progressive, intensifying quality we found in the Hebrew hithalek. It does not describe a single act of seeking. It describes a lifestyle of seeking, sustained over time, deepening through its own momentum, oriented always toward a destination that lies beyond the current horizon. Exeteo is what 300 years of hithalek looks like from the inside. And the reward, the text implies, is not merely blessing in the conventional sense. The reward is God himself. The reward is lakach, being taken, being seized, being repositioned from one category of existence into another, by the direct action of the one who has been walking alongside you all along. Now consider the implications of this for the eschatological dimension of Enoch's story. Because hidden beneath the surface of what we have examined is a typological pattern that the New Testament does not merely reference, it builds upon with deliberate architectural precision. Enoch is translated before the judgment of the flood. Elijah is translated before the judgment that falls on Israel. And Paul, writing to the church in Thessalonica, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 verse 17, reaches back across the full sweep of that ancient typology and applies it to the final consummation of all things. Those who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. The Greek word is harpazo, seized, taken by force, extracted from the continuum of ordinary existence by sovereign divine action, larkach rendered in Greek. The same word used in Acts chapter 8 when Philip is suddenly transported from one geographical location to another. The same word Paul uses in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 to describe being caught up to the third heaven, to paradise, to a realm of reality so far beyond ordinary human perception that he could not determine whether he was in the body or out of it. Ancient scholars noticed a pattern that most contemporary readers have entirely missed. Every instance of harpazo in the New Testament, every occurrence of this sudden, sovereign, divine seizure, is preceded by a season of sustained alignment with God. Philip had been faithfully proclaiming the gospel in Samaria. Paul had been walking with God through imprisonment, beatings, and rejection for years before his heavenly vision. Enoch had been walking with God for 300 years. The translation is never random. It is always the logical terminus of a trajectory. The pieces begin to align when we understand what this means for how we read Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 24. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Jesus is not simply describing meteorological conditions or moral statistics. He is identifying a structural pattern in divine operation, a pattern in which a world that has abandoned the Hittelech, that has allowed every inclination of the human heart to drift into only evil all the time, reaches a threshold at which God acts decisively in history. And in every iteration of that pattern, the question is the same. Who is walking with God when the threshold arrives? Not who is religious, not who is theologically informed, not who can recite the correct doctrines or maintain the correct institutional affiliations. Who is actually walking, in the Hittelech sense, in the exiteo sense, in the tamim sense, with the living God in the days immediately preceding the reckoning. This is not merely historical, it is prophetic, and it is personal in a way that should reach past every theological framework we have constructed and land directly in the center of how we are actually living. Because here is what the full weight of everything we have examined in this study converges on. The walk with God that Genesis 5 describes, the walk that produced in Enoch a 300-year trajectory of progressive transformation, that sustained in Noah a tamim wholeness in the face of total civilizational collapse, that culminated in a divine act of translation so complete that history could not locate his remains. That walk is not a relic of the ancient world. It is not a mystical achievement reserved for figures whose names are inscribed in sacred genealogies. It is the original design. It is what humanity was built for before the drumbeat of born, lived, died became the universal pattern, and the invitation that runs beneath the entire surface of the Hebrew Scriptures, through the prophets, through the New Testament, through the early church fathers, through every layer of ancient scholarship we have examined in this study, is the same invitation that was extended to Enoch at 65 years old, holding his newborn son Methuselah and feeling for the first time the full weight of what it means to be a mortal creature in a world that does not last. Begin the walk, enter the Ya'ad, agree with God about direction, about destination, about the pace required to arrive there, and then keep walking, not perfectly, not without struggle, but continuously, progressively, with the self-reinforcing momentum that the Hittelech was always designed to produce. Because the text of Genesis 5 is not merely the record of two men who walked with God in the ancient world. It is a prophetic prototype embedded at the very beginning of the human story, pointing forward to a reality that is still being fulfilled. The pattern is unmistakable when we examine the full arc of Scripture. God is still walking. The question has never been whether He is moving. The question is whether we are moving with Him, aligned, agreed, oriented toward the same destination, walking in the same direction, at the same pace, with the same wholeness of undivided intention that made Enoch findable to God and unfindable to everyone else. Sit with that for a moment. Let the weight of it settle. And now, before you move on, before the algorithm carries you somewhere else, before the moment passes, there is something more important than subscribing to a channel or sharing a video, though we do ask you to do both of those things. If this study has stirred something in you that you recognize as more than intellectual curiosity, If somewhere in the layers of the Hebrew and the typology and the ancient scholarship, you heard something that sounded less like information and more like an invitation, then this is the moment. The walk begins with a single step, and the single step begins with a single decision. Not a religious performance, not an institutional transaction, a personal irreversible agreement with the living God, a ya'ad, in which you say, I am walking in your direction now. I am agreeing with you about who I am, who you are, and what this life is for. I am beginning the hitalech. If that is the decision you are making right now, we want to know. Write in the comments below, I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and mean every word of it, because that declaration is not the end of something. It is the beginning of the walk. And if this study opened something in you, if the Hebrew grammar and the ancient typology and the prophetic pattern gave you a new window into the depths of the Word of God, then like this video right now, leave a comment with what struck you most, and subscribe to this channel so that every time we go this deep into the original languages and the ancient text, you are there for it. There are people in your life who need to hear what you heard today. Share this with them, because the days we are living in are not ordinary days, and the invitation to walk with God has never been more urgent, more ancient, or more alive than it is right now. The walk is waiting, and God, as He always has been, is already moving.